Dialogue is one of the hardest things to get right. How do you have it sound natural, but also fit your characters? Does it need to sound realistic, or is it okay if it sounds like it came out of a book? All of these are totally valid questions, and I'm going to be talking about them in today's video. 5 tips for writing dialogue. So let's get started. Sup peoples, and welcome back to another video. This is a table, yeah. Anyway, that's the most interesting thing that I had to say today. So we'll be diving right into the video. I have compiled my top 5 tips for writing dialogue, and I'll be going over them. So without further ado, tip number 1. Dialogue doesn't need to sound realistic. I decided to jump right in there with a slightly controversial one. Yeah. So the reason that I don't think dialogue needs to sound realistic is because of something that I read in the back of Saga Book 1. If you have been on this channel for a little while, you have probably heard me talk about that book and all the things that I learned from it. If you haven't, and this is your first time here, or at least your first time hearing about this specific tidbit of information I learned, I'm going to tell you that you should probably read the comic book Saga by Brian K. Vaughan. It is the book that made me want to become an author. Also, you should check the trigger warnings before reading it because stuff happens in that book. But if you get the giant, big 18-issue book 1, in the back, he talks about his writing process. And that is where I learned something very interesting. He talked about a lot of different things, but among them, he mentioned that he doesn't try to have his characters sound realistic. He only wants them to sound right. And I totally agree with that. It was something that totally changed the way that I view writing and writing dialogue. Now, the reason that I agree with this is because characters don't really ever sound like real people. Have you ever watched a TV show or a movie or read a book in which the characters sounded like, I don't know, a conversation that you and your neighbor would have? And if you did watch something or read something with a conversation like that in it, did you enjoy that? Is that what you wanted it to sound like? I feel like the answer to both those questions is probably no. The only reason that we say that dialogue needs to sound realistic is so that we don't have the conversations sound stilted or robotic, which I do think is good advice. But if we worry too much about the dialogue being realistic, we're going to lose a certain element of our characters. I know that I am writing a futuristic cyberpunk story, and the characters in that are not supposed to be realistic. Also, what is the fun in having them sound realistic when I could have them say snarky one-liners while they're fighting? So don't think so much about if your characters sound realistic, if they sound like people who would exist on this earth in this time period, or even in their time period, unless you are going for like historical accuracy. That's different. But if you are writing something like a fantasy or a sci-fi or even a contemporary novel, don't think about whether your characters sound realistic. Just ensure that they sound right for your characters. We're not going to a movie theater or reading a book because we want more realism and more reality. These are escapist fantasies for a lot of us. So I don't want to read a conversation that sounds like it came out of my neighbor's mouth one Monday morning when we were getting the mail. I want to read a book that sounds like 2 fantasy knights with magic powers are having a spell battle. Those 2 things are totally different, and you don't have to compare them. So as long as your character is saying things that your character would say, you're doing it right. Now we're gonna go from that one to tip number 2, which is much more common, and so I won't ramble on about it for too long. You should read your dialogue out loud. I need to take my own advice with this one more. It is so awkward reading dialogue out loud that I don't do it too often, but when I do, it really does make a difference. I think that reading dialogue out loud makes so much sense. It makes even more sense than any other kind of read your writing out loud to edit it. If you write your dialogue, it has to sound like someone would say it. I know that I just talked about how it doesn't need to sound realistic, but this is different. It needs to sound like words that would come out of someone's mouth. In this case, your character, which doesn't have to sound realistic, it just has to sound realistic for them. But in that same way, it still needs to sound like they would say it. So reading it out loud is actually a really good way to find out if it rolls off the tongue or if it sounds clunky and awkward. Also, if you read it in the tone that your character would be saying it in that scene, it can help you sort of like almost role play that moment. Speaking of role playing, speaking of writing and reading out loud, let's talk about how you can speak your writing, specifically dialogue. I have used this example in a bajillion videos, but we're gonna go back to it again. I have this scene in my comic, Project Punk. I will link the vlogs up above. They're pretty outdated, because they are the first videos I released on this channel, so forgive them a little bit, please. In this comic, there is a specific scene which I actually role-played before I wrote it. I know I was just talking about how you can role-play the writing you've already done, so now let's reverse that. Imagine if you aren't really sure what's going to happen in a scene, what they would say, how they would stand, what it would look like, and all the things that would come out of their mouths. You can stand here and stand there for character B, and you can role-play back and forth with yourself. And if you say a line that you like, you write it down. That's how I wrote an argument scene for Project Punk, because I really wanted it to be angry, spur of the moment, things that you probably shouldn't have said. So I didn't want it to feel like I had sat there and really thought it out. I wanted it to feel like two people with a lot of emotions were just going at each other because it's a stressful situation. So I just yelled at myself in the mirror. That is realistically, honestly, what I did. I took a notebook and I went into my bedroom and I closed the door and I yelled at myself in the mirror until I thought that it was good, and then I wrote it all down, and then I went in and I wrote it into my book, and it's pretty much word for word what I said to myself in the mirror. And it gave it that really spur of the moment, sudden feeling, which I think was really good for that scene, and I'm excited to show it to people once I'm finally able to show you this comic I've been talking about for years at this point. Has it been years? Have I had this channel for, I think it's only been a year. Has it been 2 years? I don't know how long it's been, but it's been a while at this point. Anyway, so in that way, you can role play a scene out and then write it. The same way that you can write a scene and then role play it out. Tip number 4 is following along in the same vein of making sure that conversations flow and sound conversation-y. And that is reading your dialogue on its own. I started doing this because I'm a comic book writer and then I became a novel writer. And reason that I do this is that when you write a comic book, you write a description of what's going to happen in the scene, and then you write your character's dialogue and any sound effects. The reader, when it has all been illustrated and as they're reading the comic book, will not have any of that description that I wrote. They will just have the dialogue. So I didn't want to read the whole thing with my description breaking up the conversation. I wanted to experience as close as I could to what the reader would be experiencing. So when editing, I will read the whole thing, and then I will just read the dialogue and see how the conversation flows without all of my descriptions and things that the reader will not be getting. And I realized that I could apply that to novels as well, because these characters are having a conversation, right? They aren't writing a bunch of prose in between their sentences. So obviously read the whole thing all together, because that's how readers will be experiencing it, but also read it how your characters are experiencing it. Read the dialogue on its own just to see how your conversation flows. In that way, I think that we can get a better understanding of like the push and pull of the conversation. Speaking of the push and pull of conversation, look at all these like little transitions and being so something. Tip number 5, our last one. What your characters don't say is just as important as what they do say. It might even be a little bit more important. I think that we can learn a lot from when a character lies, potentially even more than what we can learn from them when they bare their souls to us. What makes someone want to lie? What would they lie about? Why do they feel a need to lie? All of these are such interesting questions. I love characters that are liars because they're so interesting to unpack why. It gives us so many more questions than if they were just straight up with us. In this same way, every conversation has subtext. Whether it is a conversation between two mortal enemies or two best friends, it is going to have subtext. Whether it is an argument or a friendly bit of banter, it is going to have subtext. Think about what your character is saying, what they're not saying but that's right below the surface, and what's going on in their head right behind that. In this way, your conversation has 3 layers. Layer 1 is what your character is saying. Layer 2 is what's lying right beneath the surface of their words. And layer 3 is what they might not even consciously be thinking about, what's laying right behind the surface of their thoughts. I think that just makes conversations so much more interesting. It's one thing if 2 characters exchange facts. That's all well and good. A lot of conversations will probably be that. But if it's an important conversation, think about all the different things laying under the surface. For example, in my romance novel, Project Eros, which I will link the vlogs to up above, those are much better vlogs because they are more recent. Aaron, my main character, doesn't really like talking about feelings. Not because he is like a secretive character, he's actually very open and bubbly. He doesn't really like to worry people. And he tends to overthink things and assume that he's bothering people with his problems. In this way, I will have a totally cool, innocent conversation with Aaron, but he'll change the subject when it goes in a certain direction, or he just won't mention a certain thing, or he'll tell a little white lie just to avoid the topics that are currently stressing him out. Aaron is not a malicious or evil character. He is the primary character of this novel, and he has a cute little romance, and he is a nice person who is always there to help his friends. But even he has things that he doesn't say, and I think that we can learn even more about Aaron from when he changes the subject to if he actually talked about that subject, because we see another side of him than just what is coming out of his mouth. We see what his actions are saying. And in a way, the subtext is the actions under the words, if that makes sense. Because the subtext is the little things that they're doing to tell you what they really mean, or to avoid what they're really thinking about. So when you're writing dialogue, think not only about the words, but about the hidden meaning behind the words, and about the hidden meaning within your character that they might not even be aware of. Maybe a character is really stressed out about something, but they haven't admitted that to themselves yet, but they're still reacting like they are. Anyway, thank you for visiting my ramble. I hope that one of these tips helped you out. Let me know any dialogue writing tips that you have in the comments. I would love to hear them. Also, have a great day. I never know how to end these. I suck at it. But I will see you on the next page. Oh, and there will be videos here for if you want to watch them. Yeah. You should just keep watching them because I'm trying to hit 4,000 watch time hours so I can get monetized. And I am at the same place I was 6 months ago. So binge watch my channel. That's what I'm saying. That's binge watch. Anyway, thank you so much. Whether you binge watch or not, you should subscribe. But whether you do any of those things or none of those things, thank you for watching this video. Thank you for sticking all the way through, and I will see you on the next page. Till then.